Welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Peter.
All right, so I kind of want to talk about something we talked about last time a little bit, which is the institutions, kind of the existing sense-making institutions that existed for a long time, particularly in the United States and in the Western world, because we were talking about the necessity for reforms and how the IDW kind of rose up as an alternative sense-making collective. So my question is, what reforms are needed specifically in the world of politics and government, in the world of academia, in the legacy media, and in other institutions, maybe like the primary and secondary education world as well? What do we think actually needs to be done there to sort of restore some of the sense-making ability of our culture?
So that's a pretty big question, Scott.
You can start with like one of them, you know?
Yes, I was going to suggest starting with the educational institutions because I think that might be the easiest to reform. Given Jonathan Haidt's work, particularly in The Coddling of the American Mind, he identifies several of the critical problems with our existing educational institutions. And I think adopting the Chicago Free Speech Statement, for example, is a good first step. I think even just something as simple as challenging students, getting rid of the safe spaces and the trigger warnings, and particularly with students who are at some of these more elite institutions, where if they're being taught a very limited narrative about what the world is and how it operates, and coddled from kind of the reality of it, that doesn't really bode well for kind of the people who are going to be advancing through other institutions, whether it's the media or the government or corporations.
I mean, if you wanted to start from kind of like just like a fat trimming kind of like mentality, would you just get rid of the grievance studies? Like, do you think there's a place for like gender studies and black studies and all these kind of areas where you get a lot of the social justice and woke supremacy stuff? Or
yeah, absolutely.
You would just cut them out completely?
Sorry, I was answering absolutely to there is a good reason they exist.
Oh.
And I think it's important to have that critique. I think a part of free speech is welcoming that critique and embracing that critique and seeing, what is the problem with, say, police and race, right? I mean, that there is clearly a problem there. I think it becomes problematic when that narrative is flipped and used to suppress speech, in that the institution's there to welcome the critique of, say, what police are doing with regards to race. And now it's almost flipped in that the grievance studies are suppressing the speech which enabled them in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to celebrate diversity and inclusion, which is great. But if you're not celebrating free speech as, enthusiastically, then there's a real problem there. And we're not seeing that in academia or any of these legacy media that are still active. The celebration of free speech and exchange of ideas, I think that's as popular today among a certain group of people, particularly the IDW and other groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the problem that I see is student loans, in that college is accessible to many, many more people, and there's no economic incentive to major in something useful. And so we end up with a lot more people in, say, these grievance studies, or even in fields that aren't necessarily problematic from a free speech perspective, but in fields that aren't productive from a social perspective, or from an economic perspective, I guess. And because we've made all of these loans available without any conditions on what that money is used for, I think we end up with far too many people in certain majors, and as a result, too few people in, say, STEM fields.
So, like, should a STEM major be able to take out more in loans and have higher subsidization rates than like a gender studies major, or maybe even like a sociology major or a poli-sci major?
I wouldn't lend money to somebody who wants to study gender.
Is there any precedent for this? Like, I know the government definitely doesn't discriminate on this basis, but like, do any private loan givers?
Absolutely.
Yes.
I know with,
They do.
For example, SoFi, student loan refinancing company, they look at what you majored in and kind of your your earning prospects, and then choose to lend you money or not. And my understanding is that's a very private market, in that it's not federally guaranteed, but they can give you interest rates that are a lot lower because they know you're in a, you're on a track.
It's a better
that-
investment on their part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the problem would sort itself out if we didn't have this massive subsidy coming from the government for these programs, which are then being used to undermine several of the core institutions. And it just seems like this terrible system that we've defined. So when politicians talk about forgiving student loans or making college free, I think it should be absolutely free, say for STEM fields, for engineering. We want as many people going into those fields as possible in terms of building the future. If somebody wants to spend $60,000 a year to study gender or whatever else, I think they should be free to do so. Absolutely. And I think there should be professors and academics studying this. I think it's just gotten way too big.
Well, and some students actually take it so far as to say that not only are they like a gender studies major or a black studies major, or maybe even like a sociology or poli-sci major, something that's a little bit more off the path of grievance studies, they'll actually say that they're basically majoring in activism. I mean, there are students who say like, I'm here as an activist first and a student second. And if they don't say it with their words, they definitely say it with their actions in that. There are students who literally have said, I want to be exempted from certain assignments because I was out, protesting in the president of the university's office, making a list of demands and asking him to sign them all night. And, I was a little too tired to be doing my book report. They've actually asked professors to exempt them from certain assignments and say don't give me a 0. I was doing activism. And some of the professors have given in. So there's definitely a certain mentality, I think, there that is troublesome. But I actually kind of want to play devil's advocate a little bit. I mean, isn't there a place for the humanities and for, other majors that aren't necessarily super valued in the job market? I mean, because wouldn't we have the unintended consequence, or maybe it is intended, you tell me from your perspective, if we subsidized very, very heavily STEM majors, but not any kind of humanities majors, wouldn't we basically dissuade a bunch of people from following their true passion and doing what they're best at and what they're most excited about? I mean, isn't that kind of a choice that we should allow people to make instead of saying basically, okay, we'll give you $80,000 to basically get your STEM major with this loan that's going to be very, very helpful for you, or you can go major in gender studies and, tough shit, good luck. That choice is made for them at that point. I mean, who in their right mind is going to get a gender studies major? But if somebody's true passion is poli-sci or gender studies, I mean, do we want to dissuade that to that extent?
Well, I think that's the slippery slope you get when you have these loans that are tied to the state. So even if you are in favor of high subsidies for these students coming to college, you have to consider the fact that a lot of these majors are going to be artificially inflated. I understand where you're coming from, or from the perspective of an individual who's saying, okay, STEM fields, we understand that you may want to encourage that more, but if you're going to say these are guaranteed loans, how can you then say discriminated by major, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to create a world in which there are definitely, I can guarantee, if we basically said you don't get loans unless you're a STEM major, I can guarantee you that would have the consequence of having a hell of a lot more STEM majors and a hell of a lot less humanities majors. But I feel like we need people in the humanities. I mean, there is value to that to a certain extent. And it's more, I want to say it's more popular. I think one of the most common majors is psychology.
And we have way too many psychologists
oversaturated
in the U.S. I mean, I think the statistic is something like we graduate as many psychology majors every year as there are psychology jobs in the U.S. And that, I think, shows how out of whack the economics are. And maybe to provide a little bit more of a direct counterpoint, if somebody, say, majors in petroleum engineering and acting, or computer science and gender studies, and I think there's a lot of potential to do both, especially in fields like petroleum engineering or computer security systems, where you can work 6 months of the year and make enough money so that the next 6 months you can pursue whatever you want. And that from my perspective, seems like a much more productive path for society, where you get the balance of both and you let people kind of choose their own kind of optimal set of interests.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I find that to be a pretty strong argument, because you do have. I mean, we've all been to college. You have your electives, unless your major is like a full 120 credits or whatever, it's like you have room to sort of explore those other passions. It's not like you can't take your acting class or your psychology class. You can also double major. You can major and minor. I knew a girl in college who was a triple major.
Right.
So it's like,
And I think understanding, say, the scientific method is something that's really important for somebody who wants to do activism, because activism can get very one-dimensional. It can become very moralizing, and without sort of that understanding of science and, say, of statistics and of being able to read a policy paper and see, oh, these were the causes and these were the effects, I think we'd end up with better activists too.
Well, so should we see? So each college does things a little bit differently. So like where I went, we had these core requirements, and there were like about 15 of them. So like you had to take a psychology class, you had to take what they call the diversity and difference class from like a certain list of classes. I took women in perspective, that kind of thing, and like you had to take a math class, and so you kind of have these general education requirements. I guess my question is sort of like, do we need to create some kind of standard? Because what you were kind of alluding to is there are certain things everyone should have a cursory understanding of. This is the whole idea of a liberal arts education. It's well-rounded, right? Like so there's let's say there's this risk. So I'm sort of playing devil's advocate again to a degree. You have a STEM major. He's going to major in comp sci. It's a very good major if you're trying to get a job. Like you're trying to be valuable in the job market. So let's say he's a comp sci major and he just learns about computers for 4 years. Like he doesn't learn anything about Aristotle and philosophy and Shakespeare and English. It's like he doesn't learn these kind of like general things. He doesn't learn, criminal justice 101. He doesn't know his rights. How do we kind of balance that out? Is that because the system we have already kind of does that with the gen eds, right? Or are there flaws in that as well? And every college does it differently, which complicates this even more.
I think teaching is a very difficult problem. How do you teach people things that, say, maybe they don't want to learn? So I do think there's a lot of value in a liberal education, whether at the high school level or college level, having a broad exposure to a broad number of subjects. We force children to learn how to read and write and count, and I think that's a huge benefit for all of society. So I think the question is, where do you draw the line? Like what becomes part of the standard curriculum? And I mean, me personally, I'm learning all the time, where it's a lifelong process. There's no end point. Do I believe everybody else is the same or gets the same value out of it? I hope so, but I'm not necessarily sure that's true. So say forcing everybody to get a liberal education, I think could have these unintended consequences of more people dropping out of school.
Yeah, and a lot of people who they're not able to silo in college, you will notice them getting very detached, especially in like a women in perspective class, like a gender studies class. There are people who are just, their heads are on their desk, just like, God, I just want to learn how to do IT so I can get my fucking, job right out of college that pays, 60, 70K a year. It's like they just want to do that. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'll put it this way. It's like we have primary and secondary education to make people well-rounded, to give them this basic structure. Maybe college should allow people to silo more, and we should incentivize maybe trying to get a certain economic value out of your education. And yet at the same time, I think we're all kind of conceding that there is some value to learning certain basics. But I feel like we could kind of go at what happens, at the primary, secondary, and post-secondary level all day long. And it would take forever to sort of revamp, like, how would we, set up a college course load? I think an interesting question to jump into, though, in terms of like reforming institutions, as we were kind of talking about, particularly with colleges, is something that I think was kind of left out of the conversation we were having just now, is if we're going to reform the university system in particular, one thing that jumps out to me is you'd solve so many problems by just enforcing the law and enforcing basic rules of civics and engagement on campus. So for instance, when there's students, running through a Jordan Peterson speech trying to break the sound system, they should get arrested for vandalism, or for disturbing the peace or whatever. And don't throw them in jail, you know what I mean, unless they do something really bad. But like, there needs to be a support structure for freedom of speech at college campuses. And instead, the optics get tricky. Nobody wants to arrest a student activist or get caught in that with the media, and the legacy media doesn't help because they'll blow it out of proportion or they'll misrepresent it. So I just think that you need administrators like the administrators at the University of Chicago who are willing to take that stand and say, we enforce the law here. Like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, your speech is protected until it interferes completely with somebody else's speech. And if you're smashing the sound system or you're blowing bullhorns in Jordan Peterson's face, which they have done, yeah, you're no longer taking part in civil discourse. You're just committing a crime. It is a crime to disrupt the peace or to commit acts of vandalism and break things and you know, bang on the walls and scream as loud as you can. That's not part of freedom of speech. People always make the point of like, oh, no, you're trampling on their freedom of speech because you don't like them screaming in your face or whatever. It's like, that is never part of freedom of speech. So, I mean, what do we think of that aspect of? I always sort of think of that as just like, that's the first step. That's the easiest thing you can do.
Well, it's hard to know what they're actually learning in these activism majors, right? What's actually being taught and told to these students in those classrooms? You know, I get the kind of urge and the desire to make your education practical and to get out there and make a difference. And I think a lot of these students want to feel, you know, special and like they're part of a maybe larger narrative.
Well, so you said something really, really interesting I want to jump in on, and that's what are they learning in these classes? And I've taken some of these classes. Like I said, I took a gender studies class as part of the diversity and difference core at my university. And the thing is, there's this presupposition that the whole coursework, like all of the coursework, the whole course load, all the papers you're writing, all the tests you're taking, what you're learning about in gender studies isn't women. What you're learning about in black studies isn't black people. It's the oppression of. It is always the oppression of women, the oppression of black people, which I understand is a big part of their history, especially if you're talking about like black Americans, like black people in the United States. Obviously, oppression is a very big part of their history. But there is this presupposition that colors the entire educational experience where it's like what you're going to learn about is how these groups are oppressed. And it's an inherently ideological thing. It's really not educational. And, you know, at least in the class that I was taking, a certain amount of debate was allowed. You know, like we would debate certain points about just how real the wage gap was or whatever. And that was something that my professor was happy to permit, which is nice of her, especially considering the way that some gender studies professors can be. But, you know, is it a legitimate, you know, we call them the grievance studies. Is it a legitimate area of study if it's starting from this inherently political worldview in its teachings? It's not starting from any kind of really informative worldview or scientific worldview.
So I think maybe I want to answer a slightly different question, and then I'll actually answer your question. I hate it when other people do this, but
sure,
I'm going to do it. There is something beautiful about student activism, about students, you know, coming of age into the world and identifying problems and attempting to solve them. And I don't want to get rid of that. And I think both of you mentioned that coming at this with the idea of they're doing it wrong, or they're not following a certain set of principles, or they need to be constrained in some way. And I think like breaking those rules is something that young people do. And I think that actually does help drive society forward. So I think perhaps a better question is, how do we channel that to more pro-social, pro-liberal ends, as opposed to trying to restrict them, or, you know, or if they're trying to deny us free speech, well, then we deny them free speech. And I think a certain amount of kind of breaking the law is I'm not going to say a positive, but it's something that historically has served us well, I think.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, if we were to go back historically to the 1960s, when students were protesting the Vietnam War, many of them felt that was a justified protest into saying, I'm not going to be drafted into this war. I don't feel this is a just war. So they were breaking the law to do that.
Right.
Because they were standing for something that they felt was right. So I kind of agree with you in that sense, that there are certain laws or certain government programs or wars that you feel are unjust, and that you need to break the law in order to make a stand and to prove what you believe in. So,
yeah, and I think that was my point about maybe striking a balance where I wouldn't want to get rid of these courses, but I don't want people only being exposed to these courses. So like Scott was saying, oh, well, somebody just wants to get in and just do IT. I think IT is relatively harmless, whereas if you're exposed to, say, an entirely Marxist worldview, and that is just your college education is, Marxism 101, 201, 301, term paper on Marxism, I don't think that serves society well. And I think in those cases, it's not even a liberal education, it's an explicitly anti-liberal education. And so perhaps how can we provide a more balanced education so that people don't have a very sort of like flat worldview?
So could you almost maybe see, but I feel like this wouldn't work. It's like you could say, oh, so maybe you can't major in these things, but the classes would still exist? Because what you seem to be saying is it's okay as like a tertiary academic pursuit, but as your primary academic pursuit, and I would totally agree, if you're learning day in, day out about, just feminist, worldview of like women are oppressed and this is how the patriarchy has been oppressing you for hundreds of years, that's probably not good for your brain, man or woman. Like that's probably going to have a negative impact and make you have a very skewed view of the world. We have seen that in many cases, especially in some of the conversations that Jordan Peterson has, where he's like, Jordan Peterson makes these great points about like, do you think the man that invented the tampon, was he part of the patriarchy? You know what I mean? It's like, it's not that simple. People get their worldviews oversimplified, and it's when they're getting drummed over the head because their primary academic interest is gender studies. But, correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you're sort of making the argument, well, maybe if people took these classes, kind of like I did, I took one as part of like my gen ed requirements, but I didn't major in it. And I do feel better for the experience. I'm actually glad I took the class. I'm glad that I had the conversations that I had. But the problem is, like, if you can't major in something, there's not going to be a department for it.
And I don't want to go off on like a Marxist conspiracy theory, but I've heard plenty in that, if students are going into university and taking out loans with sort of whether it's grievance studies or poli-sci, kind of just this general anti-liberal, anti-capitalist idea, well, then they graduate from college and they haven't majored in anything quote unquote productive. And now they're burdened with a lot of student loans. I mean, all of a sudden that starts to look very revolutionary because you essentially have created this underclass of people that are tied to student loan debt that they can potentially never repay without the skills that they were supposed to technically get in university. Something about it just really seems like a bad self-reinforcing cycle.
So it's like basically the actual academic aspect creates this sort of sense of social victimization, and that you're constantly being told like people of color are victims, women are victims in these classes. But then you become a financial victim,
right?
Because so it's like you really just maximize, and this is where I think a lot of the victim complex comes from. Is like, who are most of like the blue-haired ladies screaming at Jordan Peterson? It's a lot of gender studies major who have six-figure debt. Right. And it's like, on some level, you can understand why they feel victimized, especially if they're like not well put together, physically unattractive. A lot of these people have unusual appearances. They're very unkempt. Jordan Peterson likes to say they're not well put together. It's a very nice way of putting it. So it's their social outcasts on some level, and they're financially the definition of being financially unsuccessful. They're in a huge amount of debt. I mean, that's worse than being bankrupt. It's like,
and I think this is where I empathize with them and also blame the institutions, because fundamentally, like, I would feel tricked, right? Like I went to college and knew I had to major in something that I could get a job because I was taking out debt. I don't think all people who attend college have that understanding. No. And so, they're right in a sense in that the system, whether you want to call it the patriarchy or not, but these giant universities that are potentially just degree mills pushed you into all of this debt and then kind of left you out to dry. I don't agree with a lot of their worldview, but I think there are legitimate grievances there in that this system was designed in such a way where presidents of universities or the coach of the college football team, they make loads of money.
So I want to make a little bit of a counter argument here, or just like bring in a new point or perspective, which is that I'm realizing, looking back, one thing I was interested in during my days at university was just looking at the distribution of who had what majors, like what majors were the most popular. Like I mentioned earlier, I happen to know that psychology is like one of the top 5. Right. Gender studies majors are exceptionally rare. There actually aren't a lot of people. Almost every, especially woman who goes to college, but most people take some kind of gender studies class, again, often because of some kind of like diversity gen ed requirement. But there are actually very few gender studies majors. So, is the problem really these departments which are producing, at my university, which was quite large. They were maybe producing like a dozen students per class. There were not a lot of gender studies majors at my university. Is the problem maybe actually wider departmentally? Like, because obviously like sociology.
Yeah.
Sociology is basically social justice, a social justice worldview. And then psychology, it's funny. So Jordan Peterson has the joke where he says, and I've been bringing up a lot, but, one in Rome. But anyway, it's like, Peterson brings up the point. He always says, like, if you're wondering, when people talk about conservative clinical psychologists, I always say they're all in this room because he's the only one. It's like, maybe that's another area where there's a lot of sort of political skewing. And, I came from the poli-sci world, and I know that there are very few. There's like a few conservative poli-sci professors, I feel like, at most schools, especially public schools, but it is skewed very heavily. I think Jonathan Haidt has done some really good work on this with Heterodox Academy, where he's pointing out, as he did in Coddling the American Mind, which is a book that'll probably come up a lot on these podcasts, and with good reason. He brings up how it's like if you're like 60% liberal to conservative, or like even like I think like 65, 70%, you're still okay. Once you get to like 80%, like 4-1, like progressive to conservative, it's not sustainable. Like you end up in a place where these departments, which seem not inherently political, or at least I shouldn't say not inherently political, because obviously poli-sci department is political, but I should say not inherently progressive or not inherently woke or social justice oriented. These departments, they inevitably end up that way, because if 85% or 90% of the psychology professors are progressive or social justice oriented individuals, that's going to happen, even though it's not gender studies. So, I think that we've been talking about the grievance studies a lot, but I mean, really, it goes beyond that. If it was just grievance studies, we'd only be seeing like 15, 20 of these people coming out of even the largest universities, like the one that I went to.
I think those are just the most obvious examples, but I think you're right in terms of sociology, psychology, political science, potentially being the biggest sources of a lot of these ideas in terms of their spread. Even if you don't explicitly learn them, the culture is very much oriented around a certain worldview.
And conspiracy or not, they're going to end up in that situation regardless, right? Going back to your point that, are universities sort of artificially doing this to create these departments, or is this just like self-selection by these students? I think the responsibility lies on both ends. These students, we have to make sure that they take responsibility for making these decisions and knowing what they're getting into regarding student debt.
And I do think that the bubble has burst to an extent. The past few years, I mean, when I went to college, which was not that long ago, it was just a few years ago when I was at university, there were already so many memes and jokes about even political science, which is it's not quite as made fun of. It's not quite as much the object of ridicule as like art history. For years there's been like, oh, you're an art history major, have fun flipping burgers with your art history major. That kind of expanded to like political science even by the time I was going to school, because a bachelor's in even a relatively reputable or seemingly useful field like political science, in theory, politics and government is a perfectly legitimate thing to study. But really everything that is not STEM kind of started to get that stench to it around the time that I went to university. So I do think that people are kind of waking up to the fact. And the other thing that sort of makes me think this is that I knew a lot of people in the world of politics where I was operating who they would volunteer in a lot of campaigns, they'd get internships, and they wanted to work in politics. But you know what their major was? It'd be like nursing or biology. Mm-hmm. So they were sort of hedging, which we seem to have identified, I think, as kind of the smartest move, which is use college as a networking opportunity if you want to, be involved in, obviously for psychiatry, you got to get your PhD and stuff, so you don't really have a choice. But like politics in particular, activism, it's like, do you really need to pick a major that's in that kind of an area, poli-sci, gender studies, whatever. Maybe you should major in nursing or STEM or something that's really in demand. I mean, hell, teaching is in demand to a certain extent, even if it doesn't pay the best. But,
Actually, I think you bring up a really good point about teaching not paying the best. And I think that gets back to the economics of these universities where, you look at teachers who need a graduate degree in order to teach at an entry-level position, where it's like you have to spend so much money going to school. And it seems like the system is very close to breaking in terms of being able to kind of have sort of the same level, the same percentage of people going to college. And so I wonder, and maybe hopefully it sorts itself out. I mean, barring some sort of giant government bailout, I think we're going to see a lot of universities close over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think that'll be a good thing. And I think it'll force us to rethink what education is and what it should be and who should be going to college, and come up with hopefully other wonderful alternatives to college for people who are just, if you just want to do one thing, if you just want to be the IT guy, why go to an institution that makes you do all these liberal arts?
Just watch YouTube tutorials. I mean, it really has reached
Yeah.
the point where there are so few things. I mean, yeah, if you want to be a doctor, you should probably go to college. But, doctor, lawyer, all that. But like, there are actually very few things you can't learn from the internet at this point. Like, there's not a whole lot that if you really dedicated yourself to it. And look, a lot of people need the structure, right? Like, you might not learn computer science as effectively if you're just looking at YouTube tutorials than if your professor is like, hawking you for, your reports and your projects and things like that. That might help to have that structure. I see that.
And but there's also mentorship, which I don't want to discount, because I think a lot of people progress in a field through mentorship, even if it's whether it's in school or out of school, in whatever way you can get that really helps you to
I think
advance.
the apprenticeship model, for example, is
Yeah.
a pretty good parallel to that. And actually, while you were talking, Scott, I kept thinking of Christina Hoff Sommers' book, The War Against Boys, and some related statistics about how women do better in school than men. And it seems like the education
By a lot.
system is geared much more toward the female model than the male model of learning. And
What
so-
is the male model of learning? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I always hear this point, and I don't. What exactly is the difference? I know like boys like to move around more and stuff like that, but it's like, in theory, what is the alternative? Like,
I think it's in terms of just how long boys are able to sit still.
So they just need, like,
and then
more
just
recess?
Topics of interest, watching the planes go around in circles.
She also talks about the fact that certain boys need structure.
Yeah.
And it's on the bell curve, right? It's not all boys. It's just sort of on the extreme ends of boys and girls. Certain boys need to have structure, discipline, and
Right.
something to aim towards. Yeah.
And interested in things like video games or how things work. It's a different set of interests. I mean, there's certainly a lot of commonalities, but I think the structure, and sort of just sitting in one place for a while, and the social organization has definitely shifted towards what women like. And you go to a lot of graduate schools, and it's majority women in the majority of programs. So obviously it's working very well for women, but a lot of men are dropping out. So I wonder how much of the current structure of the university is just due to, I guess, the increasing numbers of women getting degrees.
yeah, well, and I feel like in general there's sort of like a feminization of discourse. I mean, like the whole idea of like speech equals violence. Most boys have been in a fist fight at some point in their life, and so they know that there's a big difference between speech and violence. I think that's a very feminine concept. Although I don't know, I guess girls fight too, but it's not as common, and it's not often. I mean, their form of bullying and conflict is more relational, another thing from coddling of the American mind, but it's less physical. So yeah, I mean, is that kind of what you're getting at? That there's somewhat of feminization of the entire institution of academia, and that's been a factor? Because I sort of, I don't know, this point I always find kind of strange in that it sounds to me like, let me just play devil's advocate here. It's like, it sounds to me like boys are just harder to teach. Like, it sounds like girls are easier to teach. Like, they're better at sitting still. They're better at sitting down and studying and reading, and they get bored less easily. Like boys, I think they probably get, diagnosed with ADHD significantly more, right? They're like it by an order of magnitude. So to a certain extent, it just sounds like boys are harder to teach. But I guess, it obviously depends on how you look at it. Because it wasn't that long ago, I mean, like 50, 100 years ago, that men were doing significantly better than women in academics. But obviously that was before the women's liberation movement. So I don't know, how would you respond to somebody who's just saying like, yeah, men are harder to teach. They're not as good at school, like, and it's on them. Like, what is the sort of more sympathetic way of framing that, as I'm sure Hoff Sommers does in the book, which I have not read?
I wasn't necessarily making a point about maybe differences between men and women, but I think maybe again, I'm going to answer a question you didn't ask, but then I'm going to answer. I promise I'll answer the one that you did actually ask, and I want to keep the discourse alive. I don't want it just to be I have a stump speech here. So I think the point that I was trying to make is, perhaps progress has gone too far in that as schools were opening up to women and taking in more women and seeing, oh, well, maybe, the military school structure isn't the right one for women, or, oh, maybe, the way that boys like fight with each other, tolerating that, maybe that, isn't good for, when women are around, they end up, in these fights with more physically intimidating men. And so I wonder if the education system has kind of taken that mantle and run with it too far, and to the point where it's no longer serving the vast majority of boys, and it's also starting not to serve women, at least from the financial perspective of women trying to become teachers or nurses or being led into perhaps careers they don't want to be in.
So like the alternative, like what the boys might benefit from is more of like a militarization or more of like a physical focus. I mean, what exactly would an education system that is better for boys look like? Because I don't know. Like I guess I'm a pretty young guy. Like I don't really know what the alternative is. I don't know what it was like before, there was a feminization of the education process. Like I just don't know. I don't know. Like just more recess. Do boys just need more moving around? Do they need more experiential learning? Do they need more? Again, to me, it just kind of, I don't know. It just gets me to this point where I'm like, man, it just seems like guys are just harder to teach than girls. Like, I say this as a man. It's like.
Well, I think yes, that's perhaps true. I think Hoff Sommers makes the point that boys need both more freedom and more discipline in terms of you need to wait, until a situation plays out, whether it's a fight or a bullying, you need to let that go a lot longer for boys because chances are they'll sort it out. And that's actually developing lots of pro-social behavior and doesn't end up with, these boys holding on to rage that they can't express. But at the same time, the discipline also needs to be stricter where, if you have these classrooms, it's like, well, everyone can speak whenever they want. And, it's like, oh, very, feelings and relationship focused. That's just going to lose a lot of guys.
Yeah. And she talks about like 3 different models, right? In terms of education, and that you have to consider those who are more sensitive, those who are in the vast majority, that moderate category for boys and girls, and then for the boys, that sort of more structured and strict, but at the same time allowing for them to sort out physical bullying and other kind of pro-social issues that they might go through. So it's more about the alternatives that we need to offer instead of trying to create this, one-size-fits-all model for education. And that applies to the university as well, right?
So in terms of this idea of like structure, what I think I'm getting and my understanding from some of the stuff that I've read, because I've read a little bit about this, and what I'm hearing is that like boys benefit from an environment where the answers on the test are somewhat binary, like it's math or science, and it's very structured in that they're learning something very straightforward. There's no participation, aspect. There's no,
Trophy,
group.
you mean?
There's no, yeah. There's no, like, there's no. Well, I mean, participation grade as has become so common. It's like there's no like group project. There's no like.
There's more competition. I mean, that's another
Right.
thing that seems to be lost is just the idea that competition is a good thing. And I think that helps motivate a lot of boys, whereas girls in school might not be as interested, or maybe they're more interested in cooperation, or it's a sort of a different structure of learning. And, to answer your earlier question, and it's like, yeah, maybe boys just aren't as good at learning and future is female, that's...
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it's an interesting thing in that it's like I don't know. I guess in theory, I would just think that like it seems like boys maybe have more of an interest in the very objective forms of learning. It's just like I'm going to take this test. It's very structured. I know the answers are either right and wrong. Whereas maybe women are excelling because there's more of an emphasis on like writing a paper, which grading a paper is a pretty subjective thing. Like they give you a rubric where they're like, this is what I want you to do in this paper. But ultimately, I mean, like you always hear these jokes in college, especially in the more political oriented majors, where it's kind of like, if the professor agrees with your worldview, you get an A, and if they disagree, you get an F. But I
think
think
the AI should be grading papers going forward.
Google's
Google's working on it.
You know what? I bet you we're not that far. But so I want to ask about, I kind of want to move on to sort of staying along the same lines of like reforming institutions. I want to just move on to a different institution. And I want to jump to the legacy media, which I think we identified last time. And I would tend to agree with this, is like the one that is on death's door, like the one that is really like arguably already dead. Like the legacy media is like near death. I mean, what does reform look like for the legacy media?
I think a return to more investigative journalism, sort of this long form journalism, kind of getting away from the clickbait that we're subject to on a nonstop basis here in 2019. I think if you look at, let's say, the reporter who was investigating Jeffrey Epstein, I think that's a fantastic example of just really great things that can come out of sort of these legacy models of operation. And I would like to see more of that. I think, again, like with the universities, and me having studied economics, am biased toward viewing everything in an economic lens. I think it's how do you make the economics of the legacy media work? Like we were talking about the economics of the university kind of being corrupting. I think the economics have kind of gone the other way, whereas the universities have been showered with money. I think the legacy media has been squeezed for money, and so they've become increasingly desperate under the new model of just getting clicks on the internet and selling ads. And I think that's driven a lot of, I'd say, what we see as the problems, and they have to say cut investigative journalism or this this long form in favor of really, the race to the bottom of the brainstem. That seems to be what a lot of technology is about.
Yeah, I think that, I think it's a very good point. It's very true that the legacy media is just under this incredible financial squeeze. I mean, I think there's almost no industry that's dying faster than print media is dying. So I think that's a major factor, and that when you say sort of they need to maybe focus more on what they can still do that's positive, which is, at the end of the day, I think the way to phrase it is actual journalism. Because when you talk about, it's funny, you were talking about how like they need to move away from clickbait, but I think most people would agree the clickbait isn't even journalism. Like it's not media, it's not journal. I guess it is media of sorts, but it's definitely not journalism. And I think that the conflation of editorialization and opinion and news is a big problem as well. Like the most popular things in the New York Times, I think, might actually be like the editorials, or at least the things that like go viral. Like, because what do you read when you read the actual news? You just read the headlines. Like there really isn't. I think that the print news format of like a wall of text, that's just not sustainable. People don't want to read, 3 pages of text to learn what they can learn from Philip DeFranco, who I'm a big fan of on YouTube, in, 10 minutes. So, for me, the future of media sort of goes along the lines of, I consider the gold standard to be what Philip DeFranco does, which is he is informative. He does actual journalism, which is fact-based and investigative, as you said. It is sort of like classical journalism, investigative, informative, and yet it has a little bit of a clickbaity aspect. Like, he uses kind of clickbaity thumbnails and titles, but the actual content itself is very informative and very fact-based and very ethically sourced and ethically made. So I think that, frankly, when I look at the legacy media, I say the legacy media has to just die and move into new media. And I think we're already seeing that happen. I think that the future is sort of the Philip DeFranco model of like, yeah, I sort of do this goofy 15-minute news show on YouTube, but frankly, I'm doing the best journalism there is, which is journalism that is fact-based and objective and fair and unbiased.
I agree. I think the way forward is to adopt the same models that we're seeing in alternative media by saying, okay, it's quick and to the point, but it's accurate. And that's what we want in a very short, medium format from the mainstream media. But it can be a multi-pronged approach in the sense that they can also do long format debates, discussions, interviews, the things that we see in podcasts, right? But do it in a show for like an hour or two. And yes, there's going to be ads, of course, but you're going to see a full interview with a candidate running for presidency. And it's going to be just a deep dive with them and not sort of this clickbaity,
I mean, are Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan journalists to an extent, right? Because it's like they do the same thing they do on Face the Nation, right? They just do it in a better format. Like, why are those people on Meet the Press and Face the Nation, all the Sunday morning talk shows, why are they journalists and yet Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin aren't? I mean, they do a hell of a lot better job of getting into it. Like, look at the Joe Rogan Bernie Sanders podcast, for instance. I mean, like, is it like how do we feel about that? Like, just opening up the idea of what is and is not news media.
I think there's a difference potentially between, say, print journalism and maybe a story that's been researched over the course of weeks or months, and maybe something more akin to cable news or, say, talk radio, particular conservative talk radio. I think the Joe Rogan model is a little more akin to, say, talk radio or to and what we're accustomed to seeing in, say, a CNN or a Fox News, where he'll sit down with somebody. It's longer form, and he's doing a lot of great things and providing a much more balanced perspective, and not just trying to promote a particular agenda. So I think he's doing great stuff, but I think it is very much in the same. It's in the same arena as what I guess originally, say, maybe somebody like an Andrew Breitbart was trying to create.
Or you sort of compared it to like cable news, because what I think about is like Rachel Maddow is considered a legitimate journalist in many places, and yet Joe Rogan is not. And they pretty much do the same thing. One of them just does it better. Like Rachel Maddow does pure editorialization. She does almost no fact-based reporting at this point. She peddles conspiracy theories. And yet it's like, oh yeah, MSNBC, that's real news. People just turn it on and they're like, here's the news. And when they look at Joe Rogan, it's like, oh, well, he's just a podcaster. And I don't know, maybe we're starting to see that shift, though, especially seeing Bernie on the Joe Rogan podcast was pretty cool. And I think seeing a lot more people kind of do like the Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, Joe Rogan little like IDW media circuit, if you will. And they're getting pretty big guests. I think that it's sort of, I think that opinion journalism is somewhat of an oxymoron. I think that commentary, we should say, the commentariat is shifting, and the commentariat is a very big part of the legacy media. I think the commentariat is shifting completely, but I guess fact-based, actual objective reporting, I think Philip DeFranco is like really the only good example of a place where that has shifted, and he has somewhat of a monopoly over that market. I can't think of anyone else who does like a hard news show on YouTube. I mean, people do like drama stuff. Keemstar does like Drama Alert, where it's just about like gossip. But I feel like DeFranco has this like monopoly over like, I am a new way to get your news. Where's that going? Like if there's an alternative to, Rachel Maddow and some of the poorer reporting from, say, CNN's website or Politico or the New York Times or Washington Post, because they've all turned out to be very biased as well. What is that going to look like? Like, do we think that those institutions themselves, like, do we think the Washington Post and the New York Times are going to return to form and actually do good, unbiased reporting? Or
I think it's potentially two very different animals that we're dealing with in terms of print media and, say, cable news. And I think cable news, I mean, especially the invention of the 24-hour news cycle, and everything is breaking news all the time. It's kind of infuriating and impossible to watch. So it's great to see kind of these alternatives pop up. And I think everyone that you mentioned, whether it's Joe Rogan, Philip DeFranco, seems to be replacing the cable news model, which, while I would imagine is in decline, isn't anywhere near its deathbed relative to print media.
I think cable is actually looking pretty bad. Like cable news, I think that print just sort of like moved online, but I don't know, actually. I feel like I should have done more research. I'm actually kind of curious, like, when will New York Times have to like shut down their website, if ever? Like, I don't know, maybe they're good for another 50 years. Maybe they're going to shut down tomorrow. I mean, I highly doubt tomorrow, but it's like, I guess I sort of wonder just like, who is the audience for print news? Like, nobody reads a newspaper anymore. Some people go online and they'll like read a little bit from like a website, but a lot of people, it's just like they go to BuzzFeed. They go, actually, you know what? You know where people get their news? Twitter. No, seriously, that's where people get their news. It's like, is news, I'll put it this way. There was clearly a purpose to the news media pre-internet. Pre-internet, people needed to get information about what's going on in the world. And the best place for them to get that would be the versions of mass communication that existed at the time. TV, print, radio. Now we have the internet. If you want to know what's going on in the world, you just look up like what happened today. Like you go to the Skim or you go to Google News or which, I know those come from news websites, but frankly, you go to Twitter and the hashtags are going to tell you what the biggest things going on are generally. You'll get an idea through word of mouth, through the internet. Like, things will seep through. Even in your YouTube feed, it's like some of the people you watch on YouTube are going to talk about these things. Is there really a purpose to like a large news media world? Like, do we need that full infrastructure that we had? Or can it just kind of be like decentralized to the point where it's like, yeah, I get some of my news from Twitter. Like, is that okay?
I think it can be decentralized, but I think the problem is that the legitimacy that the legacy media had is lacking today. Mm-hmm. And it had it at one point. And that legitimacy was, whether you could argue whether it was warranted or not, it had kind of a mission statement. Each media had a mission statement that was, we're devoted to trustworthy news. The mission statements today, can we name them? What is Rachel
I
Maddow's
think
mission statement?
MSNBC eventually changed it. At one point, it was supposed to make them seem nonpartisan. It was like, but now it's just like forward, or it's like something that has like a vaguely progressive
Yeah.
sheen to it.
Yeah.
And then CNN, I think, has some kind of saying that like, or it's New York Times. It's "Democracy dies in darkness." Is their
That's
new
WAPO.
motto?
It is.
Or I'm sorry, that's Washington Post. That's right. And it's like that's obviously supposed to be some kind of dig at Trump. You know, it's like in the whole post-truth era. But you know what I'm really wanting to get at is like, do we need a news media, or can it be completely decentralized? Like, do we need a New York Times? Do we need a paper of record, or can we just have like, look, if you like Philip DeFranco, go to him. If you like this one guy on Twitter, go to him. Like, it's.
I think that works for really big national stories. I think one of the things that's lacking in my life is, say, local news and local news coverage and commentary
Yeah.
on that. And you know, maybe there are people doing it locally, but that seems like the one thing that, you know, before we used to have all of these, you know, I say even mid-sized cities would have their own newspapers, and now, you know, New York Times is probably going to be around for another 50 years. WAPO, you know, if Jeff Bezos donates $1 billion to them, they'll be around for another 50 years. So I think we'll have these national sort of legacy media outlets for a long time. But what we're losing is the smaller papers that have been consolidated on the local level, that while you can get, you know, your national news, say from the hashtags, you're not going to get your local city news, or it's going to be much more difficult, or like maybe you just won't care. And that, to me, as people just stop caring about what's going on in their local governments and their local cities, like that's just most disheartening, because everybody seems to be so focused on the national. And I wonder how much of that is just due to the fact that these papers have consolidated because of the economics of it.
So yeah, this is a really interesting point, actually, and this has come up before when I've spoken to people about this, that the local news is actually a place where we still really need somewhat of a national infrastructure. Like, we need this idea that every city has its own local newspaper, and there are dedicated objective reporters. And people have made the argument to me, because I know a lot of people who work in journalism, and they say really good journalism, like objective fact-based journalism, is still being done, but it's mostly on the local level. And I find that to be generally true. If you read local news, it's actually a lot less politicized and editorialized than national news, and that makes sense, all things considered. But I guess the thing that's interesting about this point to me is, like, people move around a lot now. Like, almost nobody stays in the same community for 30 years. I mean, I know there are some people that, like, they start families, but, like, even that's getting less popular. People are having less kids. They're having them later. People move around a lot. You know, I've lived in 3 different cities in the past 5 years. It's like, I guess I wonder, with the need for local news, the people who are reading local news, it's like, I'm raising my kids here, so I want to know everything that's going on in my little neighborhood. But for a lot of people, local news is just not interesting or relevant. Like, how many people really read local news? Because the thing is, how many people are really invested in a single community? Because, like, you know, I don't read the news in my neighborhood because I don't know if I'm going to be there for any longer than like 2 or 3 years, because I'm a pretty young guy. I don't have any kids. You know what I mean? It's like, so I guess I sort of wonder if we can broaden this conversation to like the changing family dynamics and the changing social dynamics of just people moving around a lot more, making local news kind of perhaps irrelevant, maybe not.
I think that's a little scary thought to think about, because so much important government happens at the local and state level. I mean, if you look at the share of total government spending in the U.S. is 50% national and 50% local. The local government has a way bigger impact on your life than the national government. So why do you care about what's going on in the national government when most of your life is spent in the local government? So even if you're only here for 1 or 2 years, it's hard to make a moralizing case that, oh, you should care about this, young kids. And I worry there's this, the way that you described it, it sounds so extractive, in that I'm just going to move to the city and take whatever I can from it without giving anything back. And so I don't have to care about it because I'm not going to be here. So I don't care about any of these people who are here. That's a really scary mentality to have. And I think you are actually touching on something that's true. And I think that's, it's sad to see, because I know so many people who, whether actively are doing, some are, I'd say most are passively doing it. Some are actively doing it, where they're coming into a city knowing they're only going to be there short term and just taking what they can and packing up.
Yeah, and I think this has a major impact on the whole idea of local news. As I've said, it's like the level of investment is so low
Yeah.
because of the way that these dynamics have changed. Like, I mean, just think about like the fact that like transportation. I mean, like before the invention of the aeroplane, it's like, were you really going to move halfway across the country? It's like, think about all the people who died on the Oregon Trail. It's like all these advancements all the way up to the point where like some people, they can move around as much as they want because they don't even they don't even have an office to go to. They're teleworkers, they're telecommuters. I mean, I think this actually has a major impact on the idea of local news media in particular. It's like there is no local if you don't really live anywhere, and people don't really live anywhere anymore, unless sometimes if they have kids, but that's about it. And having kids is not that popular these days.
But I think there's this, I forget who was talking about this. It might have been somebody was talking about the idea of there are people who are anywheres and then there's people who are somewheres. And the people who are the somewheres are stuck in the place in that they don't have, say, the set of skills or the background or the network to work from anywhere or to just be able to show up in a city and get a job or be confident that they can get a job. And it creates this odd, almost class dynamic in terms of the people who don't have to care about the local news because they can just pick up and leave, as opposed to the people who are, if not stuck in a place forever, they're stuck in a place for the foreseeable future and would have to make drastic changes in their lives, which may or may not be possible. And in a way, I mean, if looking at it from the perspective of a somewhere and watching all these anywheres flying around and not caring, there's a resentment that would grow. Certainly.
Yeah, there's definitely resentment in that. It's especially if you're in your neighborhood and you notice all of these like, just people who are just gonna like be vagabonds and like live there for 6 months and move on, and you know that they're not invested in the zoning laws and the what's happening next to their children's schools and who's doing drugs under the slide. I can imagine.
There's still a market for those somewheres, right? People that have been there for a long time, there has to be a marketplace for them. And so that economic model will change over time, as you guys have spoken to. It's bound to change. But as long as there's a market, no matter how small, something's going to rise. It's sort of, you were talking about how things are decentralized, and I think that's a good thing. But there's always going to be a hierarchy, right, regardless. So the level of quality that you're producing will, I believe, come to the top of the heap, and people will look to that as a primary source. And I think that's the way it's operated to a certain degree in the past, whether it's local or national news, is that there's highly respected sources.
Yeah, I
Do you
guess
see
to
that?
a certain extent, the question is like, who's gonna care? It's who wants a respected source? Because I think that you're talking about like this economic model, and you're talking about how like there will be a demand for it, and I've sort of been thinking about that just now. Is just like the demand. I think about who has a demand for local news. It's exclusively going to be like people who are about to have children or who have children. Something is going to anchor them down in one spot. Because generally people like the idea that if you're going to have kids, you try and stay in one place as long as possible. Mm-hmm. You don't mess with them too much, That's why they make fun of military brats and all that. But then I guess I wish I knew more about the statistics of like who's having kids. I think that people have been having a lot less kids, and there are a lot more childless couples nowadays. Is that correct? And so there's going to be less investment, and if we see a huge uptick in childless couples, which I think we will with the millennials and with Gen Z, as a kind of cuspy person myself, I don't know if I'm millennial or Gen Z, but anyway, as someone who's in kind of a party to both generations to a certain extent, we will see a huge uptick in childless couples. And so that sort of like economic base for local news for any institution that is based in an investment in, even local government. It's like they need people to care, to want to pay their taxes, honestly, they need people to want to go to the county council meetings. But all the woke supremacists want to do is go to DC. Right? They want to talk about national issues. They want to talk about kids in cages. When really, you were sort of making the argument, Peter, that the really substantive stuff, when it comes to people's lives, it happens on the local level. But we're losing that because there is no local. There's so many anywheres, as you were saying, as opposed to somewheres. And yet, I have this optimism, and then I'm like, but don't most people still want to have kids? I don't know. I don't know the statistics. I wish I was more well-educated on this topic. Like, how many people still want to have kids? Is it enough to prop up the sense of community that we're kind of talking about, that investment?
I think it varies from place to place in terms of, say, the ratio of say the somewheres to the anywheres. Maybe, I was kind of trying to think through an example in my head of, let's say you have like a Patreon model where, somebody supports the local news at $10 a month. You need a lot of Patreon subscribers in order to make a functional local news station or channel or journalist work at the $10 a month Patreon model. So you might be right. I mean, it might just be a case of, well, there aren't enough people who care.
Well,
to
and
make this
also,
work.
so what you said about Patreon actually made me have kind of a little bit of an idea. And that's like, what if you had people that had this really local focus, the way that Philip DeFranco does like a national news show? What if you had like a Philip DeFranco for each neighborhood? But then the problem that I realized is Philip DeFranco has enough problems getting enough money from a fully funded endeavor at a national level, mostly because of demonetization. He actually does pretty well for himself, like he has his own company and all that. But he's the one guy at the national level. You could never have a Philip DeFranco for a neighborhood of 20,000 people because
Or even 200,000.
or even 200,000. It's like the patronage rate of Philip DeFranco, it's like he's got 6 million subscribers. Generally, I think a good patronage rate on YouTube is like 1 to 2%. So it's like he's not getting a ton of people who are actually giving him money. His might be slightly higher because he's a very beloved YouTuber. He's been there for so long and he's so respected. But, you could never make a living. Although, I don't know, maybe you have volunteer reporters to a certain extent. I mean, there's less to report on at a local level. It is feasible to be a volunteer reporter. Maybe you had people, but I don't know, is that kind of a liability if you're not a paid professional and you're like the local Philip DeFranco? I'm kind of curious if anyone exists that has this kind of model. Like, could you make the local news model make the same jump that the national news model is kind of making to new media? Is there any kind of room for that? Like Patreon your way into a local newspaper of sorts on YouTube? Probably not.
I mean, I like the idea of potentially a volunteer reporter, somebody who is in college trying to get into journalism, somebody who's just retired and looking for something to do. I think especially just with retirees are generally very interested in politics, and maybe having some crash course in how to do journalism. But I know a number of retirees who are just starved for things to do and love politics and maybe just don't know how to get involved. So maybe that's the hopeful side. I mean, maybe it'll be the cool thing to do.
Yeah, I think this idea of like a volunteer reporter is very interesting. You bring up the idea of like college students doing it as almost like a self-made internship of sorts, or just building a portfolio of having like maybe like a local politics or a local news blog that they run, or retirees doing it. And I have this dirty little secret that I kind of want to let listeners and you guys in on about journalism, and that's that reporting is not that hard. It's people. I worked with a lot of journalists in the world that I was working with. And at one point I was going to be a journalism major. I did do some writing and all that. I don't want to get into too many of the specifics, but people like to say like journalism is one of the hardest jobs in the world. It's really hard to be. And it requires a certain mindset and a certain ability to be neutral in your approach to things and to write well. You do have to be a good writer, but it's not the kind of thing you actually have to be like super well accredited to do. Like, I'm going to be very frank in saying that, like, this is somewhat of just, an opinion on my part, but I have a lot of experience with this. I actually could see, as ridiculous as it might sound, a retiree who's like, let's say it's a 72-year-old man. He's lived in this neighborhood for 50 years. Nobody knows it better than him. He knows it like the back of his hand. He's been going to county council meetings for, 50 years. He becomes the local reporter. And maybe on a volunteer basis. And, maybe he just takes a quick crash course, or he gets an associate's with some of his retirement fund at the local community college. He gets an associate's in mass comms so that he can learn how to, post things to YouTube, because a 72-year-old probably doesn't know how to do that very well. It's at the end of the day, you have to be a good writer, a good descriptive writer, a good informative writer, and a good neutral writer. Because I think the idea of a volunteer reporter sounds ridiculous to people, because it's like, no, you need someone who is professionally accredited. Not really. I mean, look at what Philip DeFranco did. He was a 22-year-old douchebag from Florida, and he's now become like the Walter Cronkite of our generation. I'd love to see it on the local level. I actually kind of like this idea.
Yeah, I would love to see a lot of experiments like this. It's sort of whether it's kind of teaching citizens who have time on their hands. I mean, it's what, 55% of the population has jobs and the rest aren't in the job market. So there's a lot of people who could
A lot
potentially
of those are
be
children
interested.
and retirees. So
Yeah, but I think those would be great people
Yeah.
going out and reporting. And it would be so cool to have children reporters, say at the county fair or somewhere else.
And not have it be a gimmick.
Well,
I
it
mean,
would
although I
be
guess
a
it
gimmick.
has to be a
It's-
gimmick. Like you can't not.
But
have
I
a
don't
gimmick.
think it's a problem. I think, how do we restructure journalism in a way that benefits everyone? And
But
just,
isn't that-
run some experiments?
On some level, I guess it makes me think like, man, what is the state of journalism that we're now considering? Like, what if we just get all the people that are really fucking young and really fucking old to do it? Like, what if we get all the geezers and all the fucking babies to do it? Like,
But on the flip side, like, people need things to do, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like journalism is important, right? We're talking about it. We're lamenting its decline, particularly on the local level, and particularly on the local level, it's we need, say, just everyday citizens to step up and take the role. It seems like the best idea we've come up with.
yeah, I think I kind of like the idea of retirees. I don't know how I feel about like teenagers doing it, but the idea of retirees, just because they are people who are super invested in their communities. So as a local news reporter on a volunteer basis, they would be specially fit to do it. I mean, they're people who, I mean, in theory, if you're a retiree, you're probably going to die where you are. Like you might not move anytime in the near future. You've settled in Florida or whatever. Although I don't know. I guess you'd have an oversaturated market for your retiree volunteer reporters in like Fort Lauderdale, Florida, as opposed to like, Nevada or these states where the median age is pretty low. But
there are retirees everywhere.
right.
It's not-
I was just thinking that. Yeah, it's like there'd be people for it everywhere. I mean, some markets would just be easier than others if you wanted to be like a prominent volunteer reporter of sorts. But yeah, I kind of like this idea of the volunteer reporter, especially if it's retirees. I think they're actually especially fit to do it. It's because you want someone who is invested in the community, like a local news reporter. That's the other thing. A lot of local news reporters, it's like they're just waiting to get a job at the New York Times and start, traveling all around America writing. Like they don't care. They don't care about the little neighborhood,
Right. And potentially they're overqualified. I mean, to your point, if it isn't actually that difficult, then, it is a stepping stone for them. Whereas in this model, it would be just another way that you invest in your community, as whether it's like keeping up your lawn or knowing your neighbors. It's spreading the news among your fellow citizens.
And that idea of the overqualified local news reporter, I gotta say, I have seen it reflected in so many of the journalism students that I knew. I worked very, very closely with student media when I was, in school. And, I, again, don't want to get into too many details, but the resentment that you get from being like a local news reporter who really wants to do something meatier, that's a very real thing. I'm not going to say it's easy to do local news reporting. There's an investigative aspect where you got to be clever and you got to have good people skills and all that. But the actual writing aspect, like if you're a decent writer, if you're a good writer, it's not that hard. And so I do know a lot of people who they're somebody with national aspirations that gets their first job out of college writing for a paper that ultimately covers a town of 10,000 people. And they do have this, like, I don't know, they're just sort of like, their career is on the back burner. Like they're just sort of, I guess they're incubating, they're learning, but there's really only so much you can learn. Like, I mean,
So we have too many journalism majors because of the economics of the universities, which are then killing the economics of journalism.
Yeah. All
My
right.
economic worldview, sorry.
I kind of want to transition over into something a little more topical. There was, and it would be hard to tell like what date this is on because this happens on a pretty regular basis, but there was violent demonstrations and unrest in the city of Portland, which again, it's like which one, like which iteration of this are we talking about? In this case, it's August of 2019, and there has been there was a clash between, I think it was the Proud Boys, which I should have done more research. I'm not actually 100% sure. I know Gavin McInnes was their founder. They're called like a far right, like perhaps white supremacist organization, but I don't want to go out on a limb because I don't know exactly what their like mission statement is. But they're obviously like an extremist group. They go to these demonstrations and they get in fights. And of course they clashed with Antifa, everyone's favorite anti-fascist, and I'm saying that with air quotes, organization, which finds anyone who is nominally right of center and punches them in the face, calls them a Nazi, and then punches them in the face. So there was a big clash between these two groups in Portland. And just about a month and a half ago, there was the case of Andy No, the columnist from Colette, just getting the crap beat out of him, just getting brutalized by Antifa. And now this is happening in Portland. There were, I think, like 13 arrests, lots of people getting really badly hurt. Guy got hit with a hammer, like destruction of property. There was a certain area, I think they just called it a no-go zone. They just said, like, you can't go here. So basically the city of Portland was fucked up, like real bad, for about a day. And the police did basically nothing. I mean, they made some arrests, but you can see lots of videos, often provided by Andy No himself, the aforementioned journalist who has himself been brutalized by Antifa. There's lots of footage on Twitter of people just being attacked and the police are doing nothing. And I wanted to ask, this is obviously a huge escalation. I mean, this is something that we were not hearing about just like 5 years ago, just these roving bands of LARPers or activists,
Did
whatever you want to call
Antifa
them.
exist 5 years ago?
I don't know if they did.
Or are they a post-Trump?
There's a thing called Black Bloc, which is like a tactic that I think started to get popularized by Occupy Wall Street, and it's the idea of like putting on a mask and wearing all black and being disruptive or whatever. But I don't know how long Antifa has really existed. That would be interesting to find out, because it'd be interesting to see if they got like a Trump bump, like they've existed for many years, kind of like the DSA. Like before Bernie Sanders, the DSA was like whatever, the Democratic Socialists of America. But anyway, I want to get back to sort of the question I want to pose, which is, this is it's a quantitatively pretty small group of people, Antifa and the Proud Boys, these extremist groups. My question is, what role do these extremist groups play in the ongoing culture war?
I alternate between two opinions on this. One, just let them go at it. Like, if the groups of people just need to let off steam. And I mean, this goes back to the point about Christina Hoff Sommers. Like, sometimes boys just need to get into a fight. And so I think there is kind of that side of it. It's, like you said, it's a relatively small number of people. They aren't really getting a lot of converts, like you're saying. They're on the fringes. Their ideological position isn't very clear, and it doesn't actually have that big of an appeal. And so if it is fringe elements of society who are pretty much only clashing with each other, to me that doesn't actually sound like that big of a problem. And if anything, I think it's, I'm not going to say a positive, but it's just good to have some release valves in a free society, as opposed to trying to be authoritarian and just say, no, we're gonna shut everything down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, and I know you said you have kind of two minds about this, but just to address your first mind, this one way of looking at it, I think there are a few problems with that analysis. One is that this has an effect on people outside of these groups. There are not a lot of like active Antifa or Proud Boy members. It would be like less than 0.00001% of the population or whatever. It's not a large group of people, but there are a few things. So Andy No, obviously not a member of either of these groups, still got the shit kicked out of him. He's a journalist at the end of the day. He's a columnist, a journalist, whatever you want to call him. And he was affected by it. The people of Portland, I mean, anyone who wanted to go to this area and just exist in their city, it was a no-go zone. Traffic has been stopped on numerous occasions in Portland by Antifa specifically.
This sounds like Lollapalooza to me.
Well,
Traffic was stopped.
I'm not a huge fan of music festivals.
A bunch
either.
of people went to the hospital. I think this is kind of my point, where it's so easy to say, oh well, we have these Proud Boys, and we have this Antifa, and they're clashing. The reality of what happened seems to be very minor, and so I have a hard time getting alarmed by it, and I worry that the alarmist rhetoric surrounding it is almost worse than what it actually is.
Well, I don't know. I think that there's cause for alarmism, because it's not just the violence itself that's happening. And this was another point I wanted to make, to say that like this is a big deal. This is something to monitor very closely. It's not so much the violence itself, particularly of Antifa, but with Antifa in particular, it's the enabling and even the sort of like martyring or like drumming up of the sort of mythologizing them as like these warriors for social justice. I mean, people talk about, Chris Cuomo of CNN fame saying that like there is no moral equivalence between a Nazi and a guy punching a Nazi. That is a huge oversimplification of what Antifa is, because they're not just punching Nazis. Antifa they punch anyone that is nominally right of them, which includes anyone who is a moderate leftist or center or a centrist or certainly right of center. It's you're a Nazi, I'm going to beat the shit out of you. And so people are going to get caught in the crossfire, and it's going to expand beyond just these, like you're saying, let them beat the crap out of each other. Andy No being one example, it will expand beyond simply them beating the crap out of each other because they're being emboldened, particularly Antifa, is being emboldened by rhetoric which says you are excused in your violence. And so don't worry about beating the crap out of just the Proud Boys. Now you can beat the crap out of Dave Rubin outside of his apartment, which I'm really hoping doesn't actually happen. But, I'm just saying hypothetically, like.
And when that does happen, I think I'll take a much stronger stance. It's just hard.
Okay.
Given what I've seen.
Well, Andy No. It did happen. Look at Andy No. Okay, so he was there.
Yeah.
He was in the middle of it, but still, they beat up a completely non-aggressive journalist who was just there. He was not a Proud Boy. He was not a fascist. He was not a Nazi. That was a prime example of it spilling over. A journalist. Think about the intimidation of journalism aspect. Because it's not just Andy No. They do this to anyone that films them that they cannot identify as a member of Antifa. They immediately assume. They always go up to them. You can see these videos, and they're just like, are you with the Proud Boy? Are you with the Nazis, or are you with us? And then if the people, typically the journalist's response is like, oh, well, I'm not really with anyone. I'm just kind of documenting it. And then they start beating them up. It's like, that's not good enough. So I don't know. I'm concerned, but go on.
I'm with you, Scott, by the way. I just have to jump in. This is an extreme manifestation of what their ideas lead to. I don't want to ignore, especially when the violence is physically happening in these spaces. That is kind of the worst case scenario, I would say, of one is shutting down speech on campus, protesting these individuals, and then the worst part is causing physical damage to people, property. Where do you go from there? It's going to inevitably lead to the violence that we see on campuses and then in.
But both your arguments require things that haven't happened yet.
Not really.
It's a slippery slope fallacy where it's, well, if we allow this, then something much worse is going to happen. If Andy No gets beat up, that means Dave Rubin's getting beat up, which means that everybody who's right of Antifa.
But things have already happened where you see a breakdown of institutions and a breakdown of our society. So look at what happened to UC Berkeley. Milo Yiannopoulos didn't get to give that speech. Look at what happened with Jordan Peterson that once. I forget which school it was, but they broke the sound system and he had to go outside and stand up on a stump. And
that seems like great publicity for the both of them.
But it shouldn't be necessary. It's like you shouldn't have a group that can wantonly shut down traffic. That was another manifestation of this. Yeah.
But to your point, it's so few people. I've had more people try to convert me to Mormonism in the past year than to Antifa. When I see Antifa recruiters out on my block, then I'm going to get concerned in terms of then it's actually resonating. I think there's a lot of people who I would say maybe tolerate Antifa when they shouldn't be tolerating Antifa, and I think. We see people on the left doing that, and we see people on the right who tolerate more, extreme right groups when they should be denying them. So I think, I would say that's kind of my second mind of this in terms of the people who are in positions of power or people who are more who are closer to center are kind of willing to let these groups do the dirty work. They're willing to go, beat up this person or have this march or trigger these people. And I think that's where I see it more, where I see potentially more of a problem, where it's not clear that, say, people on the left want to shut down Antifa. And it's not clear that, say, people on the right want to shut down the more extreme right-wing groups. And that, for me, is actually where it's problematic, where there isn't this categorical denial of, wherever you are on the left, if you sort of agree with anything with regards to a civil society, you should be against Antifa. You should be against their tactics. And if they go and do this, and they're this crazy group that remains on the fringe and isn't even tacitly endorsed by the institutions, then that's fine. As soon as they become, as soon as the institutions say, well, this is okay, or we're not going to say this isn't okay. That silence is, that goes right back to Martin Luther King. Just all that's required for evil people to win is for good people to do nothing.
Well, and it really moves, I don't know if the Overton window is the right term in this case, but it just moves kind of like the window of not necessarily acceptable speech, but acceptable behavior and acceptable ways of seeing a fellow human being. So this is how I think of it. This is what I mean. Antifa beats the crap out of Andy No. And then there are people in the media kind of normalizing and enabling and even, making heroes out of Antifa, saying that this is okay to a certain extent. And so there's a bunch of other people. I was sort of talking about this earlier before we started recording. There's these like concentric circles of like at the center is Antifa. Then you have people who say nice things about Antifa. Then you have people who on a subconscious level are shown this. They're shown that like, oh, it's actually not completely unacceptable to just beat the crap out of someone you disagree with. So they're sort of moved to a place where I think some of the inspiration for the really nasty mobbing on social media, the nasty unpersoning, the canceling, the trying to ruin people's livelihoods, the dehumanizing, I think that comes from the fact that we're moving the needle by not completely, Antifa should not exist. Like and neither should any group that is explicitly violent. Like it literally should be that everyone just comes together and says, these are terrorists. These people cannot continue to exist as any part of our political discourse. And because we're not doing that, I think there's sort of this tacit endorsement of violence, and then also things that are close to violence, like unpersoning. All right, and I don't know. It's not close to violence. It's not the same as violence. Unpersoning.
Speech is violence.
But, yeah, but,
so I mean,
so it's things that are dehumanizing. That's another way of putting it. Dehumanizing, because violence is dehumanizing, and so is unpersoning. So is cancel culture. So yeah, I know the whole speech is violence thing. I want to go back on that and take that back because it's not the same. But it is dehumanizing would be a better way of putting it, and I think that, you see things that it's people saying things that are violent. So for instance, like somebody saying something like, I think it was like it was a baseball player whose number is 45 and they died. And on Twitter, there was a hashtag RIP45. And there were a bunch of jokes on Twitter about how like, it's too bad that wasn't Trump, the 45th president. I thought that's what it was, but it's not. And that's something that would be like outside of acceptable behavior in many, or Kathy Griffin holding up a severed head of Donald Trump, which I know she did get backlash for, but like she certainly got a lot less backlash for it than I think it would be the case in a different environment. Imagine like Nick DiPaolo holding up the severed head of Barack Obama, right? Would have been a whole different story. Would have been very, very different. So I think that there is sort of like, if we let the most extreme end of things completely go unchecked, it moves the whole conversation to where punch a Nazi, like you need to punch Nazis, is a popular talking point on the left. It's a very like mainstream thing.
But I think that gets back to is speech violence. And you look at the debate surrounding video games, right? I mean, violent video games have been proven not to increase the rates of violence. And it seems like what's going on with the dehumanizing and whatever else on the internet, that's just video games. Like that doesn't seem to be translating into a widespread conversion into the Antifa community. And that these people aren't, saying, oh, well, yeah, it's cool to punch Nazis and then going out and joining Antifa. Maybe they're tacitly tolerating Antifa, but it seems like they're just playing this video game. And I just don't see, I think this is actually a very big leap from saying, oh yeah, like I'm going to go out and or people who are saying, oh, it's great that Nazis are getting punched, to actually going out and physically doing it. And I think even the sort of saying I think the rhetoric around it, I don't think it necessarily leads to more action. Again, that's kind of speculation from my part, and maybe an explanation as to why I don't think it's necessarily as big of a deal as I guess either of you think it is.
I think you're right that we need to keep it in perspective, and that there are certain numbers that we need to think about in terms of how big this movement is. At the same time, when you say that they're just letting off steam, what they're doing is they're violating the law and they're engaging in criminal behavior. And there are some arrests that have been made.
Yeah, put them in jail.
Sure. But
after they commit a crime, not before.
After they commit a crime.
But for every arrest, there's like 10 people who don't get arrested. The law is not actually being implemented in regards to Antifa. Portland being a prime example. The mayor is clearly telling the police to, for the most part, stand down. This happened in Berkeley with Milo Yiannopoulos. This is a group that is above the law. And it's because of, I guess you could sort of make the argument,
Well, then
Because-
DOJ is going to go and investigate them. I mean, there are
Not if
systems
Kamala
for it.
Harris is president, though. You know what I mean? It's like maybe Donald Trump will declare them a terrorist organization, but
Well, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I think it's difficult to, I mean, they seem very reactionary, right? I mean, in their name is reactionary, where if there weren't these far-right groups, would they exist? Would they label new groups far-right groups? It's hard, you look at the Proud Boys, again, we don't know exactly what their ideology is. It seems like there probably should be a counter-protest to them.
yeah, but the counter protest should be a protest. It shouldn't be people who are putting up fisticuffs. And I do believe Antifa is usually the instigators of the actual violence. From what I understand, I'm not 100% sure. I think that the Proud Boys, they're kind of there, and it seems like maybe they're kind of ready to get into a fight, but they wait. They wait for Antifa to
Provocateurs.
inevitably attack them. And I'm sure there are lots of Proud Boys that are happy to get into a fight, and that's not a good mentality. You shouldn't be there to get into a fight to begin with. But I do think Antifa are usually the instigators. And Antifa are, look, I'll put it this way. The Proud Boys get reported on, and it's like these Proud Boys are extremists, and everybody has the same understanding. You said something before I'm not sure I agree with, and that's you kind of are afraid of the right wing not necessarily making an attempt, like a good faith effort, to reel in these extremist right wing groups, and the left doing the same. I actually think that's a false equivalency. I think that if you ask who's the speaker, not the speaker, Kevin McCarthy or Mitch McConnell or some like Republican figure, like what do you want to happen with like the KKK and the Proud Boys and the white supremacists and all these groups? And they're like, oh my God, I just want them to go away. I just want them gone. I hate them. I don't want them anywhere near me. They're not a part of my coalition. Whereas with Democrats, I mean, Chris Cuomo and other people, Joe Biden actually did it to a certain extent. They lionize, that's the word I've been looking for. They lionize Antifa. And here's a really good example. Here's something that if I were to try and like lay out my case really hard with the prime piece of evidence on like Antifa actually is having a little bit of influence inside the Democratic Party. Joe Biden, who is currently in August of 2019 leading the Democratic primary for president. Did you guys watch his launch video back in like April? No? So his launch video starts with him talking about the Charlottesville situation where you had the sort of like neo-Nazi rally and Antifa came and they got into fights. A woman died very tragically who I don't think was a member of Antifa. I'm actually not 100% sure. But, he made an allusion to like the brave counter-protesters who were there in Charlottesville. Many of those people were not brave. They were there to get into fights. They were there. Many of those people were Antifa members who were just there to beat people up and get into fights. There's this whitewashing, this washing away of what the counter-protesters, as they always refer to them as. They always say there's a racist march and there's counter-protesters. The counter-protesters, when you put it that way, that there's racism and then there's people who are counter to racism, it makes them sound like the best people in the world. And Joe Biden launched his campaign saying brave Americans, when in reality, they are violent, authoritarian, anarcho-communists. And there's a lionization of them that I think is very, very dangerous. And it's gotten to the highest rungs of the media and even the highest rungs of political leadership when you have Joe Biden kind of alluding to the brave Americans, as he called them, that are Antifa. And in Biden's case, I think he's just aloof. I think he just doesn't know what the fuck is going on. I don't think he actually is a fan of Antifa. But, there's a lot of misinformation about what Antifa are, especially the name is not helpful. They're called anti-fascist, but they're actually very fascist. I think that people like them. I think that if you actually asked Democrats, like, what are your thoughts on Antifa, they'd have a much higher approval rating than you'd be comfortable with, Peter. I think that you'd be shocked.
I might agree with that. I think, and I hate to bring it back to Trump, and I hate to bring it back to the
All
conversation.
conversations eventually lead to Trump.
And I hate to bring it back to the conversation
No, we haven't brought
had
him up
last
yet,
week, but I think maybe you're right from the perspective of Mitch McConnell isn't going to endorse these far-right groups. Donald Trump makes it ambiguous enough.
Right.
He might come out and deny them.
He does piss me
after
off with
Charlottesville. Like, wow, that was just cringeworthy. That was terrible, and so much ammunition for Antifa. And so I'm really curious. I'm hoping once he's no longer president, Antifa just disappears, or they go different ways, and we don't have to deal with a authoritarian, violent left.
Yeah. But so, just to sort of wrap up this topic a little bit, I kind of want to just jump back to the original question of like what role do they play? And the argument I guess I'm kind of hearing from you in particular, Peter, and it seems like Jack and I are kind of on the other end of this, is you're saying a small role. You're saying that you sort of would underplay or understate their influence.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. I mean that, just so that we have a clearly stated, yeah. Obviously they're quantitatively, they're a small group of people, and I'd love for them to fizzle out. Yeah. You know what? You brought up a really excellent point. The idea of like what happens when Trump is gone, which we kind of discussed last week, that will be very informative as to what we need to do with Antifa, because they really didn't exist in the public consciousness. I actually don't know how old of an organization they are, but they certainly didn't exist in the public consciousness until like 2015 or 16.
Yeah, and I think also to add to that, if they're no longer useful in the narrative against Trump, then they may cease to be relevant anymore. It may, in fact, be tied to, unfortunately, bringing up Trump again, his presidency, and afterwards, they're not going to amplify that message for other people and enabling it.
It does sort of harken back to our conversation last week, and I like to think it kind of strengthens or reinforces the argument I was making before, which is, say you have people excuse Antifa because they think about how much they hate Trump and how he kind of winks and nods at the alt-right, and they say, okay, it's justified. We need a paramilitary force to the progressive movement, and that's what Antifa effectively is. Like, we need somebody to intimidate the white supremacists, and Antifa are doing that for me. Eric Weinstein made a really interesting point where he said, it's like if you had a vigilante who keeps some gangster from, harassing you and you're a local businessman, and you know that the vigilante is doing something wrong, but you just kind of let them do it and you excuse it. And that's kind of what a lot of progressives do with Antifa. But I feel like the ability to excuse that psychologically goes away in the absence of Trump. Kind of going back to what we were talking about last week, which is
Let's hope so.
Certainly if a Democrat is president, but then even if if a Democrat is president for 4 years and then like Nikki Haley is president in 2024, I don't think people are gonna, you know what I mean? Like if they imagine people are beating people up in the name of they hate Nikki Haley, it's not the same as Trump, who is just such a divisive and kind of just hated figure. I mean, people do not like him. And I'm really leaning towards the fact that he's probably going to lose in 2020. That's not my official prediction. It's only August of 2019 right now, but I think he's going to lose. But we don't have to relitigate that from last week. I want to kind of move on to a different topic, and it has to do with a tweet from Neil deGrasse Tyson, this scientist. He's a physicist, right? Physicist. And Astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson. He said on Twitter, basically it was after those two mass shootings that were like back to back in Dayton and El Paso. And what he said was something to the effect of, tragically, we lost 40 lives in these two mass shootings. And I'd like to point out that in the same 24-hour period, we lose 500 people to medical errors. We lose 250 people to automobile accidents, and we lose the same number of people, like 40, 50 people, to single homicide handgun shootings. And this tweet obviously got a lot of backlash, believe it or not. People weren't happy. And, when I saw it, I was like, wow, coming from Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's like a pretty left of center guy, I was actually really surprised, and I liked the tweet. And I was really impressed that he was willing to say that. It got like 500,000 likes or something, because he's very popular on Twitter. But it also got a lot of blowback, and he ended up kind of apologizing for it. It wasn't as much of like a groveling apology as some other apologies go, but it was somewhat of a walking it back in an apology. And the way he ended his tweet was very interesting. It's something I've thought about a lot, but I've never heard it phrased this way. He said, "We need a more statistics-based public discourse." And I was like, ooh, that's a great way to put it. Because I've always thought this in particular about mass shootings. And it's interesting that he brought it up in that context, which is mass shootings kill about like 100 people a year. That's statistically kind of like not a thing. Like that's a rounding error. Like it's, there's 350 million people in the United States. And he made this point of like people are dying from other things that you don't see people up in arms about. So it's like if you're up, it's like if somebody, goes up at a town hall meeting and says, my children are afraid that they're going to get shot at school. Everyone's like, yeah, that's terrible. But if they say my children are afraid they're going to get eaten by a shark, and it's just as statistically likely, people would be like, man, these kids need to chill out. So yeah, what do you think of this idea of having a more statistics-based public discourse, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said? Is it
it'd be-
possible?
I hope so. I think Enlightenment values are still prized by both the left and parts of the right. Part of what a reasonable, scientific-minded individual would do is try to widen your perspective and to reframe the situation. And I think that's what he was trying to do, and actually giving comfort to people by stating the facts. Now, obviously, the response, and I expected it to be pretty harsh. I was surprised he made the tweet. And just reading through the comments, a lot of people were just saying, you're wise enough and smart enough to know how this would impact people, regardless of the facts of the situation. You need to be considerate of and sensitive to the emotions of the individuals, especially impacted by gun violence. And they felt like he wasn't considering that.
Oh, fuck those people. I want to jump in so hard. It's like he didn't send a DM to like the moms of every kid who got shot saying this. He broadcasted it to the public writ large. It's like, it's a perfectly valid point. People say like you need to be, and I'm not directing this at you, Jack. It's like you were just sort of reiterating what the backlash was.
Correct.
But just, yeah, but just to that effect, it's just like it's you're not responsible for like everyone who is personally impacted by something. This kind of gets to the idea that like comedians shouldn't tell jokes about the Holocaust or about rape or whatever. People say like, you don't know if somebody who's a victim of those things is in the room. It's like, that is not your responsibility. When you're a comedian, you're entertaining the room and you don't know who's in there. Neil deGrasse Tyson is talking to the nation writ large. And this idea that it's like you should have known how this was going to impact people who've been affected by gun violence. 99.9% of the people reading the tweet are not affected by gun violence. There's like the 20 people who saw it maybe, and he didn't direct it towards them. It's not his fault if the mom of the kid in Toledo who got shot sees it. Like, obviously Neil deGrasse Tyson isn't like, fuck this lady. like it's such a ridiculous inability to assume like a certain amount of decency in him. This idea that he doesn't care that those, and he had the disclaimer of like, tragically we lost these people. Like, he's obviously acknowledging that it's tragic, and yet people want to go like, oh, he wasn't sensitive enough to the 40 people, and it's like, who knows if they even saw his tweet? Like, the families of these kids that got shot. It's like, that's not his responsibility. He's not talking to them. It's his platform to make a point about our public discourse as a whole. I just,
Yeah, I think I'm very curious as to what's the underlying psychology of the reaction to this, because me personally, I feel it was like terrible and self-serving, and he's trying to take advantage of this situation to promote a policy that he feels good about. And I think this also ties nicely into, say, the disconnect between, say, the elites and the citizens, or the technocrats and the non-technocrats, where it's like, oh, well, everything should be data-based and science-driven and all that, and it kind of turns the arms of government and society just into a machine, and you're all just cogs in a machine, and it feels really dehumanizing. And I think it takes away that aspect of, say, each individual has a soul, it has a perspective. And so I can really see why people would be outraged at this. And I mean, I think I felt pretty upset about it too, not just from him taking advantage of the situation to promote something as a selfish interest, but more of a social interest as sort of society becomes more complex, and we necessarily have to outsource more and more of our decision making. We don't want to be treated as cogs in a machine or statistics in a data pool. And I think that tweet is very emblematic of that, where there are all of these subjective experiences which also weigh heavily on people, where it's not just about the life that is lost, but say the stress that is caused, or the fact that these mass shootings have a giant outsized impact on people's lives relative to the actual harm that's caused in the mass shooting. And if you don't consider that, it's and the fact that it was targeted, it was malicious.
Yeah.
A car accident is usually random. I mean, it's sort of like just bad roll of the dice. Like, it's nobody's fault. It wasn't like due to evil. And so I feel like the mass shooting just has such the impact, and I mean, this is the same case with terrorism, where the impact of the event is orders of magnitude larger in terms of harm that's caused to humans than what can be quantified. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, by focusing just on what can be quantified easily, just like that's instinctively just feels really wrong that we shouldn't just reduce it to that quantity.
So I think you make an interesting point. I could say, I mean, clearly you kind of disagree with me a little bit on how the tweet was received, and I see your point in that it can definitely go too far in the other direction. The technocrat thing where it's like you're only looking at things in terms of like exactly how many people does this affect, and we're going to have a 100% statistics based public discourse. But I think that if I were to choose which way we need to head in, like which direction we need to move towards, I think I would defend the tweet. I would still ardently say that Neil deGrasse Tyson was making a point that needs to be made, especially when it comes to mass
Do you think
shootings.
that was the time to make it?
It was. I guess it was like the next day.
Well, can I ask you this question? Was it the time after the shootings to have these political partisan debates and start casting blame on each side for responsibility? You know, I think the media
I'm sorry, which...
the mainstream media, essentially, they're making inappropriate comments and announcements and debates right after a shooting. So I'm not justifying that. I'm saying that what I find more inappropriate is to cast blame and to make it a partisan.
Well, this is the whataboutism, and you can always say,
Well,
"Oh,
no,
what
but
about this?
so-
What about that?" And it's hard. I mean, I'm trying to purely judge Neil deGrasse Tyson and trying to understand both how, I mean, you can interpret it as generously as possible, and I think, Scott, you're taking a very, very generous interpretation of what he was saying, which is a perfectly valid one. But I think the outrage to it means that most people didn't interpret it that way, and I think it's actually a really good barometer for society. You say, okay, well, society needs to head in this particular way. It seems like people are voting no. Like they're voting we need to go the other way.
Well, so Jack's point, getting back to that, which was really interesting that I hadn't quite thought about though, was like, what do you think, Peter, coming from your perspective, where you're a little bit more, or I should say, less defensive of this tweet than I am, and I'm glad you are, because it's sort of an interesting debate to have. But Jack's whole point of like, there's a whole argument about whenever a mass shooting happens, immediately the Democrats start talking about gun control, and the Republicans start saying, stop politicizing this, let's focus on grieving and actually caring for these families, these dead people, or whatever. We shouldn't immediately talk about gun control. And obviously there's kind of a self-serving aspect to that, and that gun control isn't really a winning issue for Republicans in a lot of places. But basically I think Jack's point was like, so there's that whole argument, and I guess the thing that maybe we want to know from your perspective, coming from a different position on this, is if you are not particularly sympathetic to Neil deGrasse Tyson's choice in timing of this tweet, in that I think it was like maybe like the next day that he made the tweet. So it was definitely in the time frame of like, if there's a time not to do it, it was this time. But at the same time, there's this argument about like, should people be talking about any political aspect to this, not just the statistics-based public discourse aspect, but the gun control aspect as well. So do you think that there should be, like, basically I'm trying to find out if you're kind of consistent on this. Should there be no politicization of these strategies in their aftermath? Or is one like basically is the gun control debate okay and Neil deGrasse Tyson's tweet is not? Or do they go hand in hand for you? Or
I think I come at it from the perspective of just the marketplace reaction to it. I think it could have been interpreted very differently, and a lot of people could have.
There were a lot of people who liked it, so it was like kind of half and half. Like there were people who really liked it.
But it was still obviously very polarizing. It wasn't.
Yeah,
okay,
it was
yes.
polarizing.
It was. It wasn't very clearly, and so I think it was an interesting experiment to see where the public barometer is on, say, politicizing these issues, as to saying this. This is how I feel society should go.
See, but I think my whole point is kind of like, this isn't actually how they feel about politicizing this issue. It's how they feel about politicizing it in a way that goes against their narrative. So if somebody tweets literally while a shooting is ongoing, like there could be people still getting shot, and somebody tweets, gun control now, we need gun control now. And a bunch of those same people who were pissed off at Neil deGrasse Tyson would have liked the tweet and retweeted the tweet. But the second that he wants to make a point that's actually kind of like going against the narrative that mass shootings are this huge problem, then he's in trouble. So I actually think there's a lack of consistency there in these. I feel like you got to question the motives of these individuals more who were going after him. I don't think they were mad at him for politicizing it. I think they were mad at him for going against their narrative. And the proof of that is in the fact that they themselves politicize it by advocating for gun control. They just didn't like the fact that he was going in another direction with it.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying.
Like I would question their motives. I think that you're giving them too much credit. Like you may think I'm giving him too much credit. I think you're giving them too much credit.
Okay, so you're saying the reaction to it wasn't sufficiently
genuine. No,
Okay.
not at all. Not even close.
Okay,
I mean,
I don't say know their motives, and maybe your interpretation is correct, but I do think the people who support gun control, I mean, the vast majority of them, I imagine, have very good motives in terms of wanting to, and the mass shootings just, they obviously just become this vehicle for politics, whereas the everyday shootings that happen all across the country don't. I mean, not nearly to the same extent. And I guess Neil deGrasse Tyson, I guess he's not much of a politician, right? If he's going out there into the arena and getting eaten alive doing this, and
he's not. He's not a politician, and I think what was refreshing for some people about that tweet was it wasn't necessarily a political point, because I don't know if he favors gun control. He most likely does, right? But the point of that tweet was to give perspective, and in that sense, I think he succeeded. And I can't speak to the motives of people who were outraged. I can assume that there were definitely people who were upset that he spoke against their narrative, regardless of what his position on it was. But the fact is, he was saying something that they felt would in some way contradict or harm the cause that they're fighting for.
Yeah, okay, but I think this goes much deeper. I mean, I think, yes, we can kind of intellectualize that, but okay. I mean, I'm just going to take this to a dark place. Sure. Like if your father died today and I came to you and you told me this and I was like, well, you know what? 2,000 other fathers died today. Like that's kind of what he did.
So I think
that really, I mean, that bothers me. Like regardless of my political persuasion, that reaction.
No, I understand where you're coming from.
So I think that it's different, and I was kind of alluding to this before. So that's a one-to-one interaction that is very deeply personal. So like I said, had Neil deGrasse Tyson DM'd somebody that he knew was like the mom of somebody who died in El Paso and was just like, just so you know, your kid's kind of a statistical outlier. You really shouldn't be worried about. That would have been fucking appalling. like no one's making the argument that you should discount the emotional impact that a tragic event has on an individual. But if you're going to talk about them on a society-wide level, on a political level, having a more statistics-driven outlook can be a good thing. And Jack kind of alluded to the fact that this was unexpected from Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think he's quite left of center. It was kind of refreshing to me and to a lot of people. I think like Ben Shapiro retweeted it just because it was like, oh, this guy's making a statistically true point. It is a statistical fact that
feels like the wrong place for statistics. And actually, I was kind of wondering, it seems like the mass shooting is a big enough event that becomes a big social deal, but it's not so big that the people start becoming statistics, where it's not just, it does feel a little individual, where it's like, this was my friend, or this was my family member, this was my parents. Like you can recognize people in your own life that were like the victims of this. And it's not like, oh, an earthquake happened somewhere far away. And that feels a little more distant. And so when he does tweet that, it does seem like everybody relates a little bit to somebody who
but that's
died.
all emotions based. His whole point is that we need to be less emotions based.
And I think that was the absolute wrong time to make that point.
Here's the concession I'll make to Peter is to personalize it. I maybe wouldn't have tweeted that out a few days after the shooting. Okay, so thinking it from that perspective, yeah, I wouldn't have tweeted that so soon. However, it's a legitimate tweet, and that conversation needs to happen. And what we try to do as the IDW is encourage those conversations that are not happening in legacy media. These institutions are not serving us, and social media is a way for individuals to kind of insert maybe a more wide perspective into the situation. And yeah, I think the debate can happen whether he should have done that and the timing was wrong. But the refreshing aspect for a lot of people is just, this isn't happening. And for someone on the left to come out and say, hey, let's consider from this angle, as opposed to the more traditional perspective. I don't know.
The more emotionally based perspective.
Yeah.
But so I want to kind of bring it back to the question on a broader scale. I mean, we're really focusing on like the shootings and deGrasse Tyson's tweet. But the question being, do we need a more statistics-based public discourse? I'm kind of getting the sense, Peter, that you're kind of wary of that idea, and that we're more. So that's an interesting point of contention. And what I'm hearing from you is like, I don't know. If you could just sort of restate, I don't want to misrepresent it. So like, what are you saying about like, you're very wary, you mentioned something about like the technocrats of like, you're wary of this idea that we need a more statistics-based public discourse. I'm curious if you could expand on that.
I didn't mean to make the point necessarily that I was wary of it. I think the reaction to this indicates that society at large doesn't necessarily agree with his sentiment, and so yes, maybe some of it is
society.
political.
I'm kind of like they're wrong. Like it is a good thing for us to focus on the problems that statistically have the greatest impact on us, because like in terms of this, we have limited resources to invest from the government. So if we're spending $100 million on a problem that affects 100 people, and we're spending $1,000 on a problem that affects 10,000 people, that is a misappropriation of our resources as a society.
And I think that's a very economics point of view. And as somebody who studied economics, I think I've become, I guess, increasingly aware of the fact that not everything that counts can be counted. In that, we can't just say we're going to optimize society on these 20 statistical measures. And I think there's certainly a lot of good ones in terms of human development index and education levels and all that. But I think that's been the narrative in society for a very long time. And I don't think we necessarily need more of that. I think society needs to develop in other ways. And I think it's, let's say material wealth is something that can be counted very, very easily and has been a focus of our society for a very long time. But something like wisdom can't be counted really easily.
Yeah, so what exactly is the alternative? Like, what do we aspire to, if not to be sort of statistics driven or statistics focused in our efforts, if we're not going to be more statistics focused in our efforts to address social problems and collectively problem solve, what's kind of the alternative? Like what's kind of our barometer, our rudder, our compass? What is our sort of political compass to point us in the directions of what problems really desperately need to be solved, if not the number of people that are affected by it?
I mean, I think this is kind of one of the most beautiful things that I've gotten from Jordan Peterson in terms of we have a society that is very, say, materially wealthy and well off, and certainly there are people who are still falling through the cracks, but we have this amazing capacity to do so much with our lives, and yet people feel lost and adrift and without meaning. And he's reinserting that into the conversation in terms of what are other goals that we should be pursuing, whether through mysticism, religious experiences, even like touching on mental health. I mean, he's a clinical psychologist. And I feel like the IDW helped bring some of those ideas into my life, which was previously very quantified. And so you're totally right. It is very difficult to measure. Like, how do you measure whether we're making progress in terms of like being more compassionate human beings or being more self-aware? I think these are very personal things that are challenging. And I think kind of going back to that mass shooting. I mean, there's something about it that just really, really impacts people in a way that can't be quantified easily. And so maybe part of it is quantifying it better. But I think there is kind of this other world, and I think this other world that Peterson has certainly helped introduce me to, that is also vitally important. So that's not a great answer to your question, but I think from my perspective, I'm not even sure there is one, because you necessarily, if you are necessarily in this quantitative worldview, I feel like there's this whole other world of things that can't be quantitative.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you sort of brought up the fact that the emotional appeal of these events and the effects that they have are sort of a sign in and of themselves that like they need to be treated a certain way and maybe with a certain amount of respect. But what I would bring up is it's actually very unnatural. It's sort of like media driven. I mean, people haven't freaked out about these kinds of things until recently, I think in large part because of the sort of like disaster porn style of media coverage. I mean, it's like, we're going to talk to you about the manifesto and sow divisions. And by the way, it's what the shooters want too. We're going to tell you everything the shooter thought. Now he was racist and his motivations were so, as if his motivations really matter. He killed 20 fucking people. It's like, we're going to like show you how, there's a fucking race war and like these kids died and here's their parents crying, which doesn't actually give you any pertinent information as to what happened and help us collectively problem solve. I feel like if part of your argument is sort of that like this emotional response says something, it's like, yeah, we should pay some attention, I think, to the collective consciousness, and yet it is artificially inflated by a twisted media coverage, I think.
It is. The thing is, with the IDW, the great thing about our organization is that we have, I'm sorry, let me go back on that because I don't want to say that. I don't want to say
our
that.
Loosely
Yes.
affiliated.
Yes, exactly. Is that you have Ben Shapiro who talks about facts over feelings, and that attitude is great because we can get down past all that media inflation of events, and we can actually talk about the facts and the statistics and that information. On the other hand, what Peterson brings to us is what Peter was saying, which is meaning, and have that conversation, because a lot of people aren't going to start with the facts. They're going to start with their initial reaction to something and what that means in their lives. And if someone's having an emotional reaction, well, you kind of have to tap into that. You can't discount that. So I come at this.
I kind of understand Peter's point of view, especially bringing up Peterson. I think it's an interesting point. So Peterson comes from a place where there is both an emotional and quantitative statistical appeal to his whole thing. Like his whole thing of like finding meaning in your life and meaning over happiness and taking responsibility for things and all of that. There is an emotional, excuse me, there's an emotional appeal to that. To finding meaning in life, to taking responsibility, to Peterson's whole thing. But there's also a statistical appeal in that, like what % of people are looking for meaning in life? 100. It's like he's talking about things that have this very broad appeal, where if you're going to think about it from the sort of statistical point of view, it's like Peterson's points of coverage in the topics that he often talks about and writes about are important, not just because of their emotional resonance with people, which has been really informative and really revolutionary, but also because of the broadness of their appeal, which is ultimately a quantitative phenomenon. I mean, the thing that's most amazing about Peterson is just how many goddamn books he's sold, talking about things that you wouldn't think would be a part of literally popular culture. It's just very popular. You wouldn't think he'd be selling out arenas. There's a quantitative aspect to it as well, So I think that, I don't know, I see your point of view, but I'm still leaning towards this idea that in general, I think we could get too extreme with like everything's going to be statistics based and everything's going to be about like our GDP and things like that. I do think there is a threat. I would concede there's a threat from like a too much of a technocratic point of view. But I think if I'm going to move us in one direction or the other, it's going to be the more statistics based direction. I think we are way too emotional in our current public discourse. And I think mass shootings is a good example of when we do that.
But I think there's an element of like, how much better do things need to get? I mean, not to disparage people who are suffering in this country and around the world, but like things are materially pretty good for most people, and it seems like part of the reason Peterson has become so popular is that like we've kind of figured it out. We've kind of figured out the how of life. Like we're pretty good at that, and it's sort of like, okay, and I don't mean to discount it. I don't mean to say the quantitative wasn't important, because I think the quantitative mindset certainly got us to where we are today, but how much more can it accomplish? And I think
a lot. So this is an interesting point. I actually think it's very interesting what you're saying, which is basically like, the very statistical scientific approach was really important when we were trying to cure polio. But now that we've done that and we've invented the internet and super fast transportation and, poverty and world hunger is being eliminated faster than ever, it's sort of like, I guess I sort of see your point as like, how much do we really need to have this highly scientific, statistics-based approach when we can really start to think about, most people suffering in the developing world now isn't very statistical. It's more emotional. It's they're lonely.
Right.
It's they're lonely and they don't have a meaning in their life. So I see that point, except that there's still a lot of work to be done in the scientific statistical realm. Like there still is, part of Neil deGrasse Tyson's original tweet, to kind of go back to that, was like, the handgun violence, for instance, is actually a much bigger issue than mass shootings. Like basically there are things that get a disproportionate amount of attention when you take into account their actual effect on the world. And mass shootings are such a good example because they actually affect a proportionately pretty small number of people. But they get there is no bigger news event these days than a mass shooting. I mean, Wolf Blitzer like jumps out of his chair like, oh boy, the 20 dead, like that's enough for us to do fucking 72-hour coverage nonstop. It's like, I feel like, I don't know. That is an interesting point, that sort of like the further along we get, particularly in our scientific pursuits, we need to focus more on these sort of philosophical, existential pursuits. I do see your point, and I do think it's interesting, but I think we're not quite there yet, in that there's still some world hunger to work on. There's still some, violence in the developed world, which is kind of the topic with gun violence.
And we don't want to backtrack. I think that's the other way, where if it gets to the point where, we throw aside all the quantitative measures that we've succeeded on and totally discount science and reason, that's a very dangerous place to be.
There's
in.
like
It's
70
sort of
genders because science doesn't matter. Only
in
emotions.
postmodernism,
Yeah.
I think there is a threat there, but I think also part of what postmodernism is trying to address might be part of what Peterson's trying to address.
The crisis of meaning, right?
Yeah.
But the other part of this is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. Like part of what Jordan Peterson is doing is helping people to master their emotions and their emotional frameworks so that they can actually have reason-based discussions, right?
Yeah.
So a path forward is actually through an emotional framework that helps you rather than inhibits you.
And just saying, well, you need to be more quantitative isn't really...
Yeah, it's not going to work.
It doesn't seem like it's going to convince people to actually be more quantitative.
Unless you have that mindset.
Well, and I think Peterson, who is arguably kind of the biggest sort of like figure in the IDW, like, or at least sort of like the de facto leader in a sense, or the figurehead of sorts, I should say. Maybe figurehead is a better way to put it. He does have a remarkable ability to exist right on the line between emotion and science. And the fact that he's a psychiatrist actually kind of plays into this, right? It's sort of like I don't want to say pseudoscience. It's a social science. It's a soft science. And I think that, it's good for us to maybe sort of end on Peterson, and I think we'll discuss him more in a later episode of Going Dark. But for now, I think we should wrap up, and we're going to go ahead and do that. If you like Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast, if you liked today's episode or you liked one of our other episodes, please subscribe to the podcast here on YouTube and look for us on other platforms. Please like and share the video. There are lots of ways to boost our metrics and get us out to more people. So like it, share it. All the engagement is really appreciated. And comment in the comments down below about what you heard today. Let us know what you think. Thanks for listening.